reading a little book, perhaps appropriately entitled The Way of the Small, by a Canadian-born, originally Jewish writer named Michael Gillard. He has quite an eclectic background of experience, which includes traveling overland as a teenager from Europe to India, studying theology in Montreal, then Zen Buddhism in Japan for a couple of years, and somewhere along the road to adulthood, acquiring training to be a Jungian analyst, of which he is now a practitioner in California. Carl Jung, you may know, is that famous Swiss psychiatrist who started analytic psychology. You all knew that, right? Anyway, Gillard worked with employees of the city of New York, apparently, as well as in the mental health field, and studied with the famous Marshall McLuhan at the University of Toronto way back when, and acquired degrees in theology and social work. He's being busy. And from out of all this, he advocates the way of the small, to use his title in his book. One could argue he borrows something of ancient Chinese and even Buddhist philosophy from more than 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, while at the same time zeroes in on the value of Christian perspectives, which support the humble, the meek, the modest, or to use his term, small approach to life. Indeed, in a world that would seem very fixed on doing the reverse, that is, to encourage people to think first and foremost of the way of the big and bigger and biggest, of getting the most, it is important to understand that we would in fact seem to be inflicting upon ourselves something of an ill-conceived pursuit in that pursuit of bigness. Alternatively, as one reviewer quoting his book summed it all up, when we live small, he was quoting Gillard directly, when we live small, we live with limits and according to our means, in a way that is not inflated either economically or psychologically. This helps us to find success and happiness not only materially, but spiritually. It also helps us cope with such diminishing ordeals as failure, illness, the loss of a loved one, and aging. Living small raises the monotony of daily life to a godly level and reveals God in the little and difficult things. It makes everyday life sacred. I think there is a certain undeniable truth in this approach to life. The expectations we hold upon ourselves, our children, our environment, our bodies, and even our souls in this modern world in many ways are truly out of line with who we are, where we are going, and who as a society we intend to become. You could argue that in many ways we like to play God. And when we inevitably discover, sooner or later, we are falling short of that rather lofty reality, we get rather stressed out and even depressed. And to make up for our shortcomings, we tend to do all sorts of things, from unnecessarily carrying around guns, to consuming far more than our fair share of this earth's resources, and resorting to do all sorts of mind-numbing, mind-distracting things. In short, ours is a society which would seem to have an insatiable appetite for us all to want to be great. From who's going to be the next idol winner, though I think that's kind of wearing thin, to what world leader is capable of holding their office without being excruciatingly embarrassing. It would seem that we are constantly in pursuit of who really deserves the title of God from among our mere cohorts on this earth. And so the author of this little book advocates not becoming obsessed with the great, but of appreciating the small. Now, from the perspective of the Christian faith, there is no need to be intimidated here. Christians in this world of a variety of claims on the truth need to get used to the diverse views out there that would sometimes seem to support and sometimes undermine their Christian understanding of things. After all, the business of the Christian religion, if I can use that latter, rather unpopular term these days, is not to go in and do battle with all the philosophies and psychologies of life and somehow come out the victorious and undeniable winner, and thereby convince all humanity of the Jesus view. There are unspeakably wonderful and rich contributions to perspectives on life which are not, strictly speaking, of the Christian variety. But the core of Christianity isn't like some political campaign in which their leader is going up against all the others to win, and thereby presumably make all right with the world. Christianity is not a politics, nor a psychology, nor a philosophy. It is a spirit, a living truth that can intimately permeate all of life. Christianity is a man. And there are real merits here in looking at this simpler and smaller view. Now, you may remember the disciples once asking Jesus, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus calls a little child over and says, "Truly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Then there is that famous story of the mustard seed, the tiniest among those in the garden, which yielded growth to the greatest of trees for the birds to nest in. Being small in the midst of a vast and clearly mostly unknown universe is something like being a drop of water in an unfathomably large ocean. But the story of Jesus brings us down to earth. He saves us from being lost in an inconceivably, incomprehensibly expansive and cold universe, and teaches us a new and much warmer way of looking at the world. No doubt he knew the influences of the ancient religions that came before him, the forces of yin and yang, if you like. He saw in the streets the superstition born of so-called divinations, where in effect people would be tossing the dice to figure out the will of God. I think that carries on still today. No, the Jesus way was small. The Jesus way was small and simple. Remember from his famous sermon, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And from today's reading of the first chapter of the Gospel of John, that section entitled in many Bibles, "The Word Became Flesh," Jesus is heard to say the foundation of his church is a human being, a guy by the name of Peter, whose name means rock, Cephas in the Greek, a symbol of that which is enduring and stable, that which remains when all else is worn or washed away. Those who see this as the basis for disagreement among denominations of the Christian church have missed something here. That is, Jesus Christ not keeping the foundation of the church for himself, but establishing it through another, giving it all away, really, to a human being, to relate to other human beings. Herein lay an energy or force like nothing else on earth, or for that matter in the entire universe. Those who aspire to being the greatest leaders on earth ought to take a lesson from this story. Who among the world's leaders are so good that, like John the Baptist, would be ready to disqualify themselves for the sake of the good of someone greater than them that could be accomplished? When we witness in the modern world people really hanging on to power at all costs in all sorts of places, this clearly is not the sign of strength, but of weakness. It is a sign of not of leadership, but of the need to follow. Of course, power and control in our society are often not driven by individual beings, but by collectives, corporate entities that would seem to easily leave behind the human for the sake of fulfilling objectives that seem to take on lives of their own, independent of any human individual's will. This past week, we witnessed in the news aging rocker Neil Young. I used to listen to Neil Young every once in a while. We witnessed him together with the famous environmentalist David Suzuki, trying to make a point about concerns of pollution in native lands downstream from the oil sands production area near Fort McMurray, Alberta. A reality fueled by our need to put gas in our cars on days like today. And Rex Murphy weighed in on the discussion to say, hey, just wait a minute, that place up there is nothing like Hiroshima, as they were claiming. It isn't fair. If you're going to criticize them, says Murphy, how about the stuff that goes on in places like Russia, China, Nigeria, and other places in the world? Indeed, problems are often much bigger than we would seem to be able to cope with. And they are also complicated, it would seem. What is reputed to be the largest open-air garbage dump outside of the city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, is closing to make way for a modern facility that more efficiently separates garbage. This apparently will put out of work 2,000 garbage pickers who live in a community of 20,000 on top of the garbage dump, apparently, on a heap of unspeakable proportions where 9,000 tons of garbage is brought per day. And these people pull out recyclable things whose value has afforded them something of a living. And drawing the world's attention to this is a famous artist photographer who for more than 2 years has been chronicling the community and creating artwork from components of the dump in the midst of its many residents who live on top of them. Brazilian authorities apparently are now inspired to change all this just as the World Cup arrives this year and in 2 years, the Olympics. There are odd, large, and not very simple forces at work in the world today. Thus, advocating the small, simple approach would seem very much to be swimming upstream, you might say. But like each individual salmon whose species survival depends upon their trip, we can't afford to turn a blind eye to these things. We need to keep it simple and about people, not about money and politics and forces that we think are and might well be beyond our control. Peter, the rock. Upon you I will build my church, says Jesus. Pretty small, pretty simple. Jesus didn't say, okay, Peter, go and form a committee, start a campaign, raise some money, hire some consultants, really do a big thing here. That's not what he said. He didn't say, analyze and assess how efficient you've been at all of this and get back to me. No, quite simply, you will be my church. Someone like you and I. The question is not what is the church? That's a worldly question. No, the question is, who is the church. It is you and I, standing in continuity with the original rock, Peter. This is essentially personal. To get back to my little book, The Way of the Small, the author aptly refers to the subject of love, claiming in agreement with the Apostle Paul that one can only love by being humble and small. Love is not to be forced. Only by being willing to relinquish our desire to be in a powerful position over another can we know real love. And the power of love, says Gillert, is inversely proportional to the love of power. The power of love is the power of strength to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable is to be small, and to be small is to be vulnerable. When we reflect on the life of Jesus, he was really a corporate failure, wasn't he? He didn't win over the Romans. The church, his church, is struggling even to this day and has for centuries. He really strived and appeared not to win over worldly things. He didn't acquire more followers than had ever been known in organizations before. He didn't secure great worldly gains for himself or others, but he gave himself totally. He sacrificed himself. He was the little lamb led to the slaughter for our sake. He was meek and mild and gentle and loved not in spectacular ways that most of us would seem to want to demand, but in small, humble ways, not seen by everyone. Christianity is the way of the small, really, much as many often impatient people would like to make it the way of the great. People, especially within the church, want to see it massive and really moving forward. The outside world complains, why with such a small and insignificant group would you or I want to be part of it? As an undergraduate student in the University of Toronto, I used to wander off to the famous building on campus called Hart House. And there were all sorts of nooks and crannies in the building where you could study in solitude. And I recall on one occasion going off to a room, and at one end of the room was a piano, and at the other was a place where I could sit and read. And this fellow came. He didn't know I was there, and he sat down and he started playing the piano, and he played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, from beginning to end, beautifully. And people were walking by in the hallway, as if nothing was going on. The gifted pianist gave me a performance like I have never seen. It was my own personal concert. Now, some would say that might be classed as a failed performance. Next to no one there. Not quite. Our faith is like that. Love is like that. Caring for others is really like that. Relating in our daily life to others in the Spirit of Jesus Christ is like that. Most of the time, it will seem like nobody notices. Nobody cares. Not quite. His is the spirit and love that can change the world, sometimes in the modest, most modest, but incredibly enduring ways. Even through the likes of you and I, small people like you and I. You are the rock. You may be small, but in truth, you are amazing. Amen. Our offering will now